Dame Priti Patel.
Madam Deputy Speaker. There's quite a lot to say, if I may just indicate, post the contributions, I think, from both front benches, and I'm going to come on to them in a minute. But, I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate. This is an important debate, and I support the reduction in the rate of national insurance, and I do want to use my time today to discuss the longer-term tax reforms that I think should be coming forward. But before I speak specifically to the national insurance tax changes and cuts that are the basis of this important bill, I think, if I may, just to observe both front benches and the debate thus far, this is a very serious issue. We're speaking about fiscal matters that affect all our constituents and, quite frankly, people across the United Kingdom. And at a time when we should be really honest with the British people, we should level with them, in my view. Taxes have gone up. I don't think they want to hear trivial arguments, quite frankly, from this House at all about who is outscoring each other. And there's a degree of maturity that is needed right now, because these have been difficult times post-pandemic, but also off the back of Russia, Ukraine, and everything else that has followed. And I think, we need to look at what is being proposed today in a constructive way. The irony about today's debates, and I'm going to touch on obviously wider public spending as well, is that tomorrow we'll be here talking about estimates. And looking at the book that I've gone through and the numbers that I've gone through this morning, there's a lot more that can be done to make sure government spending is much more efficient. But we'll save that for tomorrow. This is an important bill, and this follows clearly the decisions that previous Conservative Chancellors have taken to reduce the levels of taxes taken from national insurance. Now, members who review the details of successive budgets since May 2010 will note that the government has progressively reduced the tax burden of national insurance in recent years, and members may recall that the employee threshold level back in 2010 was £5,725. So, this has been the trend, it really has. And 2 years ago, the increase in the primary threshold jumped from 9,500 to align with the tax-free threshold, which we're all familiar with, and I like to think we are familiar with in this House, at £12,570 back in 22-23. And that change in 2022 alone has already put money into the pockets of hard-working families, worth around £330 per person when that change took place. And the changes at the autumn statements, which again were, if I remember rightly, they were debated quite well on this side of the House. I think the other side was a little bit absent, if I may, in terms of looking at the implications. But those changes meant that average earners would have been around £900 better off. And alongside that, I also welcomed the reduction in NICs for those who are self-employed. And I say this as an Essex MP, the majority of my constituents are self-employed. Over 80% of my constituents work for small and medium-sized firms. They are employed by self-employed companies and organisations. And those who are self-employed who pay Class 4 contributions, many of my constituents, they make a huge contribution to our economy, and I think we should just reflect upon that. There's always more that needs to be done. That's a fact, to grow the economy, supply side reforms, stimulate employment. But actually that's huge to them because it gives them security in employment, and that is an absolute fundamental principle that all of us should be working to. And of course that's a big difference and a tax cut. So when we consider that the impact of raising the income tax-free threshold from £6,475 from 2010 to the £12,570 level we have today, that in its own right is significant because it was worth over £1,000, and that's 20% of the £6,095 increase. So the 900 average from the cuts to national insurance in the last two fiscal events are significant. And I think we should just all recognise that, what that means, not just for the economy, but for money in people's pockets. And it shows that those measures would have helped taxpayers to keep around £2,400 more of the money that they earn. And I have to be quite frank, that is not just good, that is valued and welcome. And as I think some colleagues have already touched on already, They're timeless conservative values that fulfil our mission to deliver economic freedoms and lower taxes, notwithstanding what we have seen, of course, within the tax backdrop of recent years. So our approach to national insurance and easing the burden, I'm afraid, I listened to the front bench members on the opposite side, and I always welcome their contributions, and I enjoy the debates that we have. I think it is actually a contrast to what we saw under the previous Labour governments, when we saw increases. But also, we need to be working collectively to be on the side of hard-pressed families right now. And I think, that is absolutely crucial. I could go back to the budgets of Gordon Brown and list some of the calamities that took place, but what is the point right now? Because we have to speak about the fiscal footprint that we have right now, and the measures that have been before this House that we voted on last night in the budget, and this bill in particular. And I think it's really important that we stand by our record, our commitment to lowering these taxes on income, and our ambition to go further. And I've heard with interest, this will be a debate, I've got no doubt about that, and I've stood here before saying that we should go further on tax reforms, and I believe that. I've even suggested previously that we look at merging NI and income tax, but previous Conservative governments have looked at that as well, and all members will know, and the opposition frontbench will know this as well. It's not straightforward, it is complicated, and if I may say so, some of the points that have been raised today indicate why it is complicated. But I do believe that we have to continue on this pathway, and importantly, not to recount the budget debate that we had in recent days and last week, there are important fiscal measures that mean that the public will be better off, including the fuel freeze, but also the direction of travel. And I absolutely know this, because the Treasury front bench hear from me and others a lot about this. They would like to go further in terms of reducing the tax burden. They know my own personal views around public spending right now, which I believe needs addressing and is far too high. But we do also need to think about long-term reform. And if I may, I do just want to touch on the ambition expressed by the Chancellor to end the double taxation on jobs, and the suggestion that either national insurance be phased out or is subject to reform. I've been a long-standing campaigner for lower and simplified taxes, and I'm on the record for even looking at the merger in the past. During the chancellorship of George Osborne at the time, I know that he looked at this through, as did the Office of Tax Simplification, and that's all well documented and on the record. And although those plans were not taken forward because of complexities that I've touched on, I think it's important that these debates continue, actually, because we do need to simplify our tax system in this country. And I think as Conservatives, we must always look to do this, and we must always stand up for not just lower taxes, but actually simplifying the tax system. We say this as the new tax year will begin, and people are still getting letters from HMRC. If you're a business in particular, the burdens that they see and also the complexities just in tax returns are just mind-blowing. But both our taxes on income and the thresholds at which they're both paid now, aligned at £12,500 per year, is something that I think we do need to look at, and I've made this point before. I think it was my honourable colleague here touched on the contributory principle, in particular about national insurance, through the National Insurance Act back in 1911 and further measures post the Second World War. And those points and measures were brought in to support health and medical benefits and also to support unemployment benefits. So there is a place in the National Insurance Fund Act where receipts are raised and placed into. And that distinction in the way in which national insurance is raised and dealt with compared to other taxes that end up in the consolidated fund have stood the test of time. And I think all Treasury ministers, the front bench and others recognise that as well, that this is ingrained in the fabric of our tax system and the thoughts of many of our constituents. So I think as we start this debate, and I think we are now starting this debate about lower taxes and how we can simplify the tax system, I genuinely believe right now that this is an important bill. It is a very, very important signal in terms of supporting the self-employed and hard-pressed families around the country, but also that the direction of travel from the government is very, very welcome. I do have to say, I think it is starting now through this debate to provide a clear distinction between the Conservative way forward and the Conservative approach. And it will be really interesting. You know, we had the debates in the last week around high tax, high spending policies. These debates and discussions are not going to go away. Public spending is over 1 trillion, 1.2 trillion. We have to be mature in the debates that we have in this House, but also as a government in terms of how we prioritise investment, public investment, but also how we spend taxpayers' money wisely. And I'm pleased that this bill has come forward, and I hope that this will start a positive direction of travel going forward when it comes to reducing the overall tax burden on hard-pressed families.